Hi class, this is Mr. Mitchell. This is lesson 2 of Unit 1 of American History 1, and I'm going to be talking about how the Spanish and the French and the English colonized in North America. Before diving into this lecture, let me make one correction on the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, I said that Europeans had discovered the United States, and that was incorrect. They discovered the New World, they discovered the Americas, part of which became, later on, the United States. The United States obviously does not exist at this point, but we are laying the groundwork for its eventual creation. Let's go ahead with the essential idea. So initially, Spain is going to lead the way on exploring in the North American region. They are going to be the first of the European nations to explore any part of what became the United States. They're going to ultimately spend most of their time in what is now Mexico, but they do also explore in what is now the southwestern part of the United States. France is going to come in at a much more from a much more northern direction. They are going to come into what is now Canada and settle in to what is the middle part of the United States today, and I'll point this out later on, probably in maps. The English are kind of last, and they are going to settle along what is the east coast of present-day United States. So basically, each country settles at different times in different ways and has different interactions with the Native Americans. Spain is the first nation to really explore and settle in the New World, but ultimately England is going to find dominance in the New World, as you'll see later on. So first, let's start with the Spanish as they entered the New World. Now, if you were to ask the Spanish conquistadors what their main mission was, their main mission could be summed up in 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. Now, even though God might have been listed first among the goals of the Spanish explorers, they were probably much more seeking gold and glory, and then the God factor might have been more of an afterthought. The conquistadors themselves, that's a name given to the Spanish. They are the ones that were known to go in and conquer, and you see the similarity between the word conquer and conquistador. They were the ones that go into Mesoamerica, and they are going to largely conquer the natives. I'm going to concentrate specifically on the Aztecs. And I told you in the last lecture that these Mesoamerican civilizations prove easier to conquer because they were in concentrated areas. They were all in one main place. Hernan Cortez is the one that is most notoriously known as a conqueror of the natives, the most notorious of the conquistadors. Hernan Cortez, whenever he settles, or not settles, but whenever he reaches the New World, he is going to land on the coast of what is now Mexico. The local natives are going to, some of them, mistake him for a god. He seemed to fulfill some previous prophecies of a god that would appear, and whenever they saw the technology of the Spaniards, they saw the armor of the Spaniards, they saw the ships and the cannons that the Spaniards had. These, to a lot of the Aztecs, these seemed like almost like supernatural things, and it did convince some of them that Cortez was a god. Now, what Cortez is going to be hungry for in this whole process is gold. So whenever he arrives, and again, present-day Mexico, back then it was part of the Aztec Empire, he is going to basically demand gold. He's going to see gold in the clothing of the Aztecs, and he's going to want to know where the rest of the gold is. He's convinced that there is a lot of gold. And in the end, he is going to attack many of them. And you see these 2 pictures on the right-hand side. These are both depictions of his attack of the Aztecs. And on the left-hand side, you're going to see one of the other less intentional consequences of the interaction between Cortez and the Aztecs. And this was part of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange also involved diseases. So if you look at this picture here on the right, you can see the Aztec depiction of how the Aztec people started to succumb to smallpox. So not only did Cortez attack the Aztecs while seeking gold, he actually took their leader Montezuma hostage at one point, trying to get to gold. Not only is he going to be killing the Aztecs on purpose, but also accidentally through the spreading of smallpox. In the end, the land that Spain conquers, they're going to conquer the Aztec Empire. They're going to conquer what is now modern day Mexico. And they're pretty much going to conquer eventually later on, uh, further up into what is now the southwestern part of the United States. This area that the Spaniards control is going to be known as New Spain. Now, I know I went through this first part kind of quickly and very briefly. A lot of you have taken Spanish classes or will be taking Spanish classes. And I'm sure in those classes you'll hear a whole lot more about the interactions between Cortez and the Aztecs. So at this point, the interaction between the Spaniards and the Native Americans doesn't look too good. And honestly, there were some negative consequences to the interaction between the Spaniards and the Native Americans. So I'll go through the negative consequences first. And if you look at this picture here, again, this depicts a very negative relationship between the Spaniards and the Native Americans. So what ends up happening is that Spain is going to end up, and if you follow my mouse, you can see they end up doing expeditions. They end up going into what is the American Southwest. They are going to go into what is now largely California, right here, New Mexico, here, and not on the map, but on other maps you'll see later on, they do end up conquering Florida as well. And they are going to convert some of the Native Americans to Christianity, which in and of itself may or may not sound like a negative consequence, but it does become a negative thing in a sense because of the way that a lot of the Spaniards exploited Christianity and used it as an excuse to exploit the Native Americans. So what ends up happening is if there was a Native American that was converted, and by the way, they were usually converting to Catholicism. The Spaniards, or Spain was a Catholic nation. There was this notion that basically these Native Americans needed to be quote unquote cared for or looked after by the Spaniards. And this opens the door to what becomes known as the encomienda system. In the encomienda system, Native Americans that had converted to Catholic Christianity were basically put under the care of Spaniards, but basically this was just an enslavement of the Native Americans. So the Native Americans again were being almost like treated like almost like they're being babysat by the Spaniards, but they were very abusive babysitters, and basically the Spaniards would order the Native Americans around and force them to do their bidding, again under the guise of taking care of new Catholic Christian converts. But this was really an exploitation of Catholicism in order to justify mistreatment of Native Americans, and oftentimes these slaves or semi-slave Native Americans would be exploited in the search for gold. Eventually, some of the Native Americans are going to fight back. There is a very famous rebellion of Native Americans that happens in what is now New Mexico. It's known as Popey's Rebellion. And when that happens, the Spaniards are actually largely driven out of what is now present-day United States and driven back into what is present-day Mexico. And they didn't try to come back into present-day United States for a while after that rebellion. So not only did sometimes the Native Americans rebel, but they rebelled successfully, despite the spread of smallpox, despite the fact that the Spaniards had better weapons. That being said, the overall interaction between the Spaniards and the Native Americans is actually it's kind of in the medium. It's kind of not entirely negative, not entirely positive. So I will get into the positives. One of the positives that's going to come out of the interaction between the Native Americans and the Spaniards will be the fact that the cultures do mix to some degree. It is not as if one entirely dominates the other. Whenever we get to the English later on, the English aren't going to care for mixing cultures or for seeing the good in the culture of the Native Americans. The English are going to have much more of a our way or the highway type approach. We'll get to that more as lectures move on. A lot of the Native Americans that converted to Christianity did so on their own free will, so they weren't forced. And not all of them were subjected to the encomienda system, probably especially after rebellions like Popey's Rebellion. And you actually see some intermarrying going on between the Spanish and the Native Americans. So it really speaks to the fact that they did mix their cultures whenever they were actually genetically mixing their genetic material. You see Spaniards and Native Americans intermarrying, and the people that were the descendants of these uh, intermarriages were known as mestizos. So the mestizos personify literally the mixing of European and Native American cultures. And there are still, obviously, today people of mixed European and Native American uh, ancestry. One other positive, and this is a positive that comes out of the Columbian Exchange, and it's shown in the picture here, is that the Native Americans received from the Spaniards a new source of transportation, that being the horse. And this is going to have a tremendous impact on Native American culture. It's going to help them hunt the bison uh, much more easily. You'll sometimes hear people refer to the bison, pictured here, they'll call them buffalo, but technically they're called bison. It's going to help them with hunting. If you were one of the Native American groups that got access to horses, all of a sudden you had not just an advantage in hunting, but you also had an advantage over other Native American groups that did not have the horse. Should your tribe or Indian nation go to war with another Indian tribe or Native American tribe that did not have horses, you definitely had the upper hand in these battles. So that would be a positive of Spanish interaction. It would have been a positive of the Columbian Exchange. So overall, it's a mixed bag when it comes to Spanish interaction with the Native Americans. Uh, there are some positives, there are some negatives, but one main thing to know going forward, and you might want to highlight this in your notes, is that Spain will get along better with Native Americans than the English ultimately will. The Spaniards are going to be ultimately much more willing to have a kind of give and take with the culture of the Native Americans. Again, there will be intermarrying, there will be some cultural mixing, there will be some religious mixing. The English are not going to want to interact with the Native Americans very peacefully. If they don't have to, they're going to want to take their land. They're not going to care about their culture as much. And you'll see that later on. Real quickly, let me talk about the French. The French don't, there's really not a lot to say about French settlement because the French, they're not going to come in very big numbers. So if you look at the map here, again, you can see right here where the mouse is, where the Spanish explored. Over here, if you look at the map, you can see where ultimately the English are going to settle. But first, let's talk about this area here in the middle. That will be where the French come in. So the French come in through what is now Canada, down into the middle part of what is now the United States, the Mississippi River Valley. And they are going to, just like Spain called their new area New Spain, the French are going to call their new area, guess what? New France. That being said, the French are not going to settle in a very large number. Even though they settle in a very large area, they're going to be spread out. There's not going to be a whole lot of French. And the French are really going to be kind of tied into certain forts, or not forts, but trading posts. They're going to be at certain areas located in strategically in strategic places for trade. So basically, the French don't go there looking necessarily to just take all the gold they can from Native Americans. They don't go trying to enslave Native Americans. They're there almost purely on an economic venture, and they're basically going to do a lot of trading, especially for furs, with the Native Americans. The French get along with the Native Americans the best. They make some money off of each other. The French population is small compared to the Native American population of the region, and so overall they get along fairly well. And that's all I have to say about France. Now let's get into the transition from the Spanish dominating in the New World to the English dominating in the New World. And what is going to cause the door to slowly close for the Spanish and the door to slowly open for the English is going to be a war between England and Spain. So first, we need to get into the reasons for this war. There are two main reasons why England and Spain go to war. One is religiously based, and one of them is based off of economics, off of money, off of greed, honestly. So the first reason that you're going to see the Spanish and the English go to war is because of the Protestant Reformation. So in 1517, hopefully you've taken world history by now, there will be some churches that begin to break off from the Catholic Church. And that becomes a big issue in Europe. Some countries start to align themselves more with the Catholic Church. Some countries start to align themselves more with Protestant churches. When you think Protestant, think maybe like later Protestant churches would be the Baptist and Methodist, but the earlier ones would have been, say, the Lutherans. So there are going to be some churches that are aligned with certain countries, and oftentimes these countries could go to war. Like for example, a Catholic country would be more prone to go to war with a Protestant country. I already told you in the last lecture about how Catholic Spain and Catholic Portugal tried to avoid going to the war and how the Pope made efforts to keep that from happening. So the Protestant Reformation began in 1517 in Germany. There's going to be a second Reformation that happens that's led by England uh, less than a decade or around a decade later. And that will happen whenever King Henry VIII decides to lead a reformation of the Catholic Church. He basically is going to seek permission from the Pope of the Catholic Church to divorce his wife because his wife could not bear him a male heir. And he blamed his wife for that, even though modern day genetics, we know that the male is the male determines the sex of the baby. But anyway, so King Henry VIII is going to break from the Catholic Church, and he basically is going to. It's pretty simple. He basically says that the Anglican Church will be like the Catholic Church, but the exception will be that the King of England is the head of this church instead of the Pope. So he basically takes the Pope out of the leadership position and puts himself in that place. And if you know from world history, there was this idea of the divine right of kings at the time that basically said that God puts kings in their place for a reason. So whatever the king says is really the will of God. So a lot of people in England are going to convert to the Church of England, or like it says here in the notes, they're going to become parts of the Anglican Church. This is an English Protestant church. Eventually, more people in England are going to want to have more changes happen. And you're going to see a group of people in England that want to go further than King Henry VIII ever would have wanted to go, and they are going to be known as the Puritans. They are going to want to purify what they see as a now corrupt church, and eventually they're not going to be too welcomed in mainstream England, and they're going to leave England trying to find a place where they can basically practice their religion or purify the church and what they saw was the right way as much as possible. They did not believe in religious freedom for everybody. That is a misconception a lot of people have. They really wanted just to have their religion. Other people's religion they did not really like or tolerate very much. And you'll find out later on that the Pilgrims that you learned about whenever you were in elementary school, this would have been a subgroup of the Puritans known as the Separatists. More on that later on. So in the end, England becomes a Protestant country. Long story short, and I am simplifying some world history here, but in the end, England is going to become a Protestant country. Spain is going to remain a Catholic country. So that is going to create a religious rivalry between the two, because Spain wants the Catholic Church to continue to expand, especially in the New World, and England wants Protestantism, basically an anti-Catholic movement, to expand. So that sets up part of the tension. But honestly, probably the majority of the tension is going to be economically based. Money issues tend to drive history more than most anything else. So let's get on to the other reason that England and Spain go to war, and that will be because of the ideals of mercantilism. Now, you may need to pause this video and rewind it and listen to this a couple of times because this part might be confusing. But mercantilism, long story short, is an idea that a country's power comes from having wealth. The richer the country is, the more powerful it will be. So in this case, what's written in parentheses, you may want to write that down. Now, wealth was measured in gold and silver largely back then, but long story short, again, mercantilism is the idea that a country's power comes from being wealthy. Now, the next question is, how does a country become richer? Well, one way a country becomes richer is that they sell more to other countries than they buy from other countries. In other words, they export more than they import. If you are always selling things to other countries and you're not having to buy very much from other countries, then you're going to get richer as time goes on. And this next bullet here basically restates that point. Countries want to be self sufficient and not have to import from other countries. So the question becomes, well, what if there is a resource that your country needs and your country doesn't have it and you don't want to have to buy it from another country? And that's especially a problem for England because England was very limited in its land and they pretty much had all the land they could have and they needed more things like farmland. They found all the gold that they were going to find in England pretty much, and so they needed to find other places to get gold. So how do you become self-sufficient and not have to get stuff from other countries? You form colonies. So countries, England included, Spain included, are going to be forming colonies around the world, trying to basically get other pieces of land that could supply them with the resources that they did not already have themselves. What this sets up is tension over land in the New World. Spain is settling in the New World. They are gaining territory in the New World, which gives them access to gold and silver and things that they could trade with the Native Americans for. England wants to get in on the colonies game. England also wants to be able to form colonies in the New World so that it can become wealthier. So basically, mercantilism, again, is the idea that countries' power comes from having wealth, often in the form of gold and silver, also from having other resources. And if you're going to get these other resources, you're going to need more land. And so in the end, gold and silver and land are limited. And Spain and England are going to compete for them, especially in the New World. So again, Spain already had a head start in forming or grabbing land in the New World, and now England wants to start grabbing land in the New World as well. The problem is, again, that Spain has the head start. And Spain also had a very strong navy that it could use to kind of patrol the ocean. So if you look at the map here, you can see that there's a lot of ocean right here in the Caribbean island area, and Spain is going to use its navy to kind of to patrol the area and kind of protect its land holdings from other people, say the English. They even make a fort in Florida known as St. Augustine, which you may have heard of before. So again, Spain is using its navy to kind of control the Atlantic Ocean and especially around the New World and try to keep other countries, especially England, out. Okay, so if you look at your notes now, you see that you have reason number 1, the Protestant Reformation, and you have reason number 2, mercantilism. Those are both boxes with arrows pointing down, and they're both pointing down to the war that breaks out. So in the 1580s, you're going to have a major war break out between Spain and England. And Spain looked to have the upper hand because they had bigger, more powerful ships. Throughout American history, you're going to find out more and more about how having a strong navy is a big deal if you want to be a strong country. It helps you control trade, it helps you control territory, it helps you blockade the coastline of rival nations and starve them out if you need to. Long story short, having a strong navy makes you a strong country and it helps achieve mercantilistic goals. So Spain is going to have a fleet famously known as the Spanish Armada. England did not have as strong, arguably, of a navy, but they did get the help of Mother Nature. So during the course of this war, you're going to see in 1588 a sea storm roll in the midst of some of the fighting. These larger Spanish ships of the Spanish Armada are going to be destroyed. And England is largely going to say, hey, this is proof that the Protestants are on God's side because this Catholic nation with its Spanish Armada, God just brought in a sea storm to destroy all the ships. Regardless of all that, what happens in 1588 is a major turning point. Because at this point, Spain is not going to be able to guard its territorial holdings against England nearly as well. They're not going to be able to keep England from creating colonies in the New World like they had been able to before. And so now you have the door open for England to colonize in North America. And as we all know that this is very important. The dominant language of the United States today is English, and a lot of our heritage and our history is rooted in English history and heritage and culture. So now it's time to talk about the English colonization of the Americas, and that's what the back side of this lecture is going to be about. This is going to be about the initial reasons why we colonize, and also the way in which initial colonization went. And sometimes it was successful, sometimes not so successful. Okay, so whenever people decide to move from one place to another, in this case, moving from England over here, over to the east coast of North America over here, there's usually going to be push factors and pull factors. In other words, reasons why people leave and reasons why people choose to go where they go. One of the things that makes the uh, the English want to gain land in the New World again is this rivalry with Spain that I've already gone over. The idea that if you get more land in the New World, you're going to be able to create colonies, which will make you wealthy. You'll have land, which will have resources that will make you wealthy. And honestly, some of the English that were Protestant wanted to keep the Catholic influence limited in the New World, and they maybe wanted to spread Protestant Christianity. That being said, there was another major reason that drove people uh, from England to the New World, and this is going to be certain religious minority groups. So when the English Protestant Reformation happens and England becomes largely a Protestant church, there are going to be other religious groups. The Puritans that want to go even further with reforming the church, further than most mainstream English people want to go. You're going to have the Catholics that did not convert to Protestantism, that aren't going to like it too well in England at this point. And you'll have another religious group known as the Quakers, and I'll talk more about the Quakers later on. But all three of these religious subgroups are going to be minority religious groups in England, and they are going to be, to varying degrees, persecuted for not being part of the Anglican Church. Now, keep in mind, the Anglican Church is the official church of England at this point, headed by the king. This church is not going to be very tolerant of the Puritans. It's not going to be very tolerant of the Catholics. It's not going to be very tolerant of the Quakers. And so each group at certain times are going to leave England to go to the New World to escape religious persecution. But probably the biggest reason that people are going to leave England, and I told you already that money is a big driver in history, the other major factor that's going to lead people to colonize in the Americas is going to be economic. People are going to leave England for economic opportunity. England had gotten pretty crowded. There wasn't a lot of land to go around. The economy wasn't very strong. And if you weren't making it in England, a good idea might be to try again in the New World. Now, there were some actual attempts to settle before the fall of the Spanish Armada, and they largely failed because the Spanish Armada had kind of a stranglehold over the Atlantic Ocean, and it was very hard to get supplies to these early English colonies. It's going to be hard to sustain them. So before the fall of the Spanish Armada, you will have a man named Sir Walter Raleigh bring settlers to America, or to the Americas, a couple of different times, and he's going to make a couple of attempts to settle, create colonies. One of the most famous of these colonies is going to be known as the Lost Colony. So this colony is going to be formed right before the war breaks out with Spain, and there is going to be a delay in getting resources to this colony, and eventually it disappears. By the time that the English got back to this colony after the fall of the Spanish Armada, the colony was gone. There are theories as to what happened to this so-called lost colony. The only evidence that the English found, if you look at this picture here, is you'll see the word Croatan, indicating a local Native American group. People don't know for sure if they were killed off by the Croatans, if they joined up with the Croatans. There are multiple theories. My personal theory is that this lost colony ended up intermingling and intermarrying with a local Native American group known as the Lumbee. And the reason I say that is that if you look at today's Lumbee Native Americans, some of them do have blue eyes, which is a European trait. And whenever the Lumbee were first encountered by Europeans, some of them seemed to already know English. Anyway, that's a little bit of a side story. Back onto the main point. So if you wanted to create a new colony, you needed money. Traveling across the Atlantic Ocean with a lot of people is very expensive. And if you want to have any kind of business venture, it's going to be very expensive. And what typically today people do if they want to start up a business is they create a corporation. And if you've taken civics and economics, you know that a corporation is a company where people basically buy shares of stock in the company and they pool their money together in order to build their business. That's basically what happens in the English settlement in the New World. So if you look at this chart here, you need to be careful. You need to start in the very upper left-hand part where it says joint stock company, and then follow the arrows. So a joint stock company is like a modern day corporation. It is a company in which investors put their money together in order to pay for a large project. So today, if you were going to start up a big business, maybe a new restaurant chain, or maybe if you were wanting to start up a big tech company, you would get investors to put their money together, and they would maybe each invest $1,000 worth of stock uh, uh, in your company, and then you would have enough money put together in order to start your business. Well, the business that gets created at this point is going to be known as the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company is going to be a business venture by several Englishmen to create a colony in the New World, and they're going to want to create a colony called Virginia, and they will get permission from King James in order to do this. And the thing that you need to know about whenever you get permission from a government to form a joint stock company, that permission is known as a charter. And the charter basically sets the rules of what your company can and can't do. And there's something very important that you should probably highlight. I've highlighted it here in the notes. In this charter, the members of the Virginia Company were promised the rights of Englishmen. So basically, what happens here is that they're going to be traveling thousands of miles away from England to create a company. Well, their company is going to create a colony, excuse me. But even though they're not in England anymore, they will still have the rights of Englishmen. And that is important to note. A lot of times in these early lectures, I'll be planting seeds for major things that happen later on. Right now, I'm going to plant a seed for what helps leads to the American Revolution. The reason that it's important to note that the original English colonists felt they had the rights of Englishmen is that when the American Revolution takes place, it's going to partially happen because the colonists by 1776 feel like the English government across the ocean is ignoring their rights and not treating them as equals and not giving them representation in government. And you've heard the phrase no taxation without representation. So here at the very beginning, when the very first English colony formed, you already see the seeds of the American Revolution being planted, the idea that the colonists had the same rights as Englishmen over in England itself. Now let's talk about the first settlement in Virginia, and it is going to be named after the King of England at the time. It's going to be called Jamestown, and there is a depiction of it here on the right. It was not very big. I've actually been to the site. It is a very small settlement, but it was the first settlement nonetheless. So the importance of Jamestown, which was created in 1607, is that it was the first of the English settlements to remain permanent, and it's going to be around for several decades. Today it's a historical site, but it was the first one to actually stick and not just fall apart after a few years or a few months. So Jamestown, its importance is as the first English settlement in the Americas, and it's going to be led, at least at first, by a man named John Smith, or Captain John Smith. Now, there's going to be a problem with the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company, when they settle Jamestown, they have a primary goal. They have a primary mission as part of their charter, as part of the orders of the king, is that they need to do things to make England richer. And the way to make England richer would be to find gold. And a lot of colonists are not going to spend enough time focused on survival, and instead are going to spend a little bit too much time worrying about finding gold. And that's going to cause some problems. Why are they doing this? Because again, they are a business, they are a company, and they're trying to make money. And they're trying to make the king happy. The king wants them to make money as well, because that helps out England, that helps out with mercantilism. Now, one thing to note is that when the Jamestown settlers arrive It's not like they're arriving on vacant land. They're going to have neighbors, and the neighbors are going to be known as the Powhatan Native Americans, and they had formed a confederacy. And I've talked about a confederacy before. It's whenever you have multiple governments that are loosely uh, linked under a weak central government, in this case under the leadership of the Native American leader Powhatan. Notice here, though, that initially John Smith and the other colonists are going to get along with the Native Americans pretty much because they needed them to survive. The Native Americans had food that they could give them or trade with or trade for. Uh, the Native Americans also way outnumbered the Jamestown colonists at this point. So at first, the relationship will be good, but it won't be good for very long. I told you that the English are going to ultimately have the more negative relationship, and I'm about to get into that now. So again, if you look at this picture here, you can see how where Jamestown would be. Do I have in this one? There it is right there. So there's Jamestown, and then you can see all these Native American tribes surrounding. So Jamestown wasn't in a position to be aggressive. They weren't in a position to be rude. They had to be nice to the Native Americans, at least at first. Okay, now we'll go, if again you'll follow the arrow to the next box. Jamestown's going to have a problem. And the problem is that more people start moving to Jamestown before Jamestown's really ready to grow. Eventually, Jamestown is so big that they are going to struggle to feed themselves, especially when the winter hits. Now, one of the unfortunate things for Jamestown is that they settled during a historic drought when it was really hard to grow crops. And this crisis kind of reaches a peak in a time known as the starving time. So during the starving time, you will see uh, food become very scarce. People keep moving into Jamestown, even though they can't even imagine being uh, in a house, living in a house where there's barely enough food in the house for your family, and then 5 families try to move in with you. You're going to struggle. And so you have this time known as the starving time. So, how do the colonists respond to this? Well, one of the things they do is they start to go negative when it comes to their relationship with the Native Americans around them. They're going to start stealing food from them, they're going to start attacking the Powhatan natives. In order to survive. And then the Powhatan natives aren't going to appreciate this, so they will attack back. They will cut off trade. They're going to realize that that the Jamestown neighbors are not very pleasant neighbors at this point. What else do the Jamestown people do? Well, the worst part of the starving time will be the winter of 1609 through 1610, where they run so low on food that they end up eating non-traditional meat sources, such as dogs, such as rats. And yes, as you see in the notes, they do even end up resorting, in some cases, to cannibalism. There's this infamous case of a man who kills his wife and then cuts up her body and salts it so that he can save it for later. He gets executed for murder shortly afterwards, but you can sense the desperation that the Jamestown colonists had. They had not found gold, they had not found a way to economically sustain themselves, and they are running out of food. They're going to have to find a way to make money, and they can't find gold, so they're going to need an alternative. So we'll go on to the next box. And this is very important. And this will be planting lots of seeds related to the future of American history. So eventually, again, like I said, Jamestown is not going to be able to find gold, but they will eventually find something that, in a sense, is better than gold. They're going to find a source of income that is addictive. Now, Spain had already developed a type of tobacco that was considered tasty, but they kind of held on to that secret, kind of the way Coca-Cola holds on to the secret recipe to their drink. Well, shortly after the starving time, around 1611, John Rolfe is going to start to develop. He's the other famous John besides John Smith in Jamestown. He is going to start to develop in Jamestown a specific blend of tobacco, a specific breed or strain of tobacco that becomes enormously popular and addictive in England. Long story short, tobacco becomes Jamestown's gold. And this is what saves Jamestown from starvation, from economic hardship, And at this point, they are going to start to thrive. There's going to be two problems with tobacco, though. One problem is that the more that England demands tobacco, the more that the colonists are going to want to plant it. To plant more of it, you're going to need more land, which means you're going to have to fight Native Americans over that land to take it from them. The other big issue is you're going to need a labor source that is going to be able to harvest all of this tobacco. And ultimately, it's going to be slaves, African slaves, that do this. I'll come back to that in a moment. One thing of note, and this is again planting the seed of the American Revolution, is that in 1619, Virginia is going to create what's known as the House of Burgesses. This is a representative government in Virginia, and it's going to be in Jamestown. So Jamestown will be the capital of Virginia at this point, and they're going to create a government called the House of Burgesses. And basically, what happens in the House of Burgesses is that you have people that govern on behalf of the rest of the colony. They are representatives of people in the rest of the colony. One thing to note is that they really were the wealthy white male members of the colony. They were not the women, they were not the non-whites, they were not the poor. So it is going to be representative, but it didn't represent everybody in the colony. However, this is the first time you have representative government in the Americas. And this is important to note because whenever the American Revolution happens, the American colonists have gotten very used to governing themselves and aren't really used to the idea anymore of being governed by a king. And they're going to look at their local governments as the true authority and not King George III, and so they'll be more prone to have the American Revolution. Again, we'll talk about that more later on. Let's get back to the issue of tobacco. So there is a labor shortage. The more tobacco that the Jamestown colonists want to grow, the more land they need, which they're going to fight Native Americans for, but they're also going to need a labor source. And I told you what that ultimately will be, and that will be African slaves, but it wasn't that way at first. So at first, in order to bring over workers to work the tobacco, Virginia Company is going to start up what's known as the headright system. And basically, anytime a wealthy landowner brought over someone to work this land, that wealthy landowner was given 50 acres on which to start growing tobacco. Now the question is, who's going to be the one actually planting and harvesting this tobacco? And it's not going to be the wealthy landowner that just got 50 acres of land basically for free. There were many poor people living in England at this time. There were many people that were desperate, and they started to hear about this idea that if they signed a contract and worked on one of these 50-acre plots for 4 to 7 years, then they could get a free trip to the New World. Once their contract was up, they could get their own piece of land, and these are going to be known as indentured servants. So indentured servants, kind of like you see in the picture at the top, they were poor Englishmen who felt still entitled to the rights of Englishmen, and they are going to agree to work 4 to 7 year contracts in exchange for transportation into the Americas. And again, if they finished their 4 to 7 year contract, then they would get their own land. They'd be able to start over economically. They could maybe start a family. The other source of labor that exists, as you see at the bottom here now, you're also going to see the importation in 1619 of African slaves. So this initially, if you had to compare the two, indentured servants were initially the primary labor source to pick this tobacco and harvest this tobacco. Africans were kind of a secondary source. Ultimately, indentured servants are going to rebel because they don't like their contracts, they don't like their treatment, they don't feel like they're given the rights of Englishmen. And the wealthy planter class of Jamestown and of Virginia eventually will turn later on to African slavery as the primary labor source. That will happen after Bacon's Rebellion. I'll talk about Bacon's Rebellion later, but that is a very crucial turning point in the history of early America. Okay, now to the right of this box. There is no arrow there, but you do go to the right now where it says War in Virginia. So I told you that the need for tobacco planting, it is going to lead to the need for a labor source, but it will also lead to a need for more land. So eventually, war is going to break out in Virginia, and you will see uh, fighting between the Powhatan and the people of Jamestown. And again, it largely was because the Powhatan had realized that they were starting to die of smallpox. They didn't appreciate that very much, and they blamed the English for that. But they were really upset that Jamestown was basically taking over, and the English were taking their land and planting tobacco on that land and taking it from the Powhatan, who had been there for much longer. Uh, and they're even going to attack Jamestown. Now, ultimately, they're not going to win. Ultimately, the English are going to prevail. So overall, keep in mind that the English do not get along with the Native Americans. They are not willing overall to intermingle with the Native Americans. They are uh, basically there to take land from them and push them out. And eventually, there will be no more Powhatan in the Virginia area, or at least in the Jamestown area. Now, when this war breaks out, the King of England is not exactly happy about hearing about all this violence, and the English government is actually going to take Virginia Company's charter away, and they are going to put this colony under the direct authority of the king. The king is going to appoint a governor. They're going to take away the right of self-government that the House of Burgesses had established, and Virginia is going to become a royal colony. A royal colony is one that, again, it does not really have much in terms of representative government. The people aren't really electing representatives to run the colony on their behalf. Things are coming from the top down now. Things are coming from the king. There's going to be a governor that's going to be appointed by the king, and the people of Jamestown don't have a say. That sort of thing at this point is not going to create an American Revolution, but eventually, whenever the king acts this way, say around 1776, it does create enough of a reaction to help lead to the American Revolution. So, a royal colony is a colony that is under the direct control, or almost the direct control, of the king. The king appoints a governor to do what the king wants in that colony. The other kind of colony is a proprietary colony, and that will be what I get to next. So, a proprietary colony is a colony that is owned by an individual and it's not run by the English government, not directly, and it's individual or individuals or by a company, and they have a little bit more freedom. So the other of the Chesapeake colonies that I'm going to talk about after Virginia will be Maryland. And then let me pause to explain something I should have explained sooner, is that the Chesapeake colonies were the first of the southern colonies. I don't think I explained this earlier. And the Chesapeake colonies were the two colonies that bordered what is today known as the Chesapeake Bay. Virginia was the first one, Maryland was the second one. Eventually, there will be more southern colonies. Okay, on to Maryland. So, why does Maryland come along? Well, in England, remember that the Anglican Church, which was the Protestant church that was created by Henry VIII, was not very tolerant, depending on who was in charge, but overall was not very tolerant of Catholics. And there were still a lot of Catholics in England at the time. And so basically what happens is Maryland is going to, there's going to be a man known as Lord Baltimore, and he is going to get permission from the English government to create Maryland. And Maryland is going to be meant to be a safe refuge for Catholics. So Maryland becomes the first of the or one of the first colonies, not the first, but one of the colonies that is going to be created for to help people escape religious persecution. This will actually technically happen after the Puritans had settled up in the New England area. I'll talk about that later on, but this is an example of a colony being created to create a situation of religious freedom. The problem is that Maryland is right next door to Virginia, and Virginia, being run almost directly by the king, is definitely not Catholic and is definitely Protestant. So in Maryland, even though the Catholics were in charge, there are still a lot of Protestants right next door in Virginia, and a lot of them actually spilled over into Maryland. And that's going to create tension. And what could have happened is that the first two English colonies could have fought each other, could have fought a war, maybe kill each other off, and then you wouldn't have English colonies anymore. And this would not go over well with England, and so they had to find a way to kind of compromise. And so what ends up happening is you have a law passed at this point uh, to keep this religious rivalry down called the Toleration Act of 1649. And basically, it's going to allow a measure of freedom of religion. If you were Christian, you were okay. Other religions like Judaism or Islam or a Native American religion would not be tolerated. And if you were to pause this video and read the wording down here, you'd see that if you were not a Christian, you basically were given the death penalty. The reason this is worth noting is that even though this was not a total freedom of religion, this is at least a partial freedom of religion and a step towards religious toleration, which, if you know your civics and economics, you know that part of the First Amendment to the Constitution allows for freedom of religion. So even back in 1649, you see the seeds being planted for freedom of religion in what would eventually become the United States. One final note, Maryland, like Virginia, is going to make money on tobacco. And they eventually also will have indentured servants and eventually African slaves doing the work. That concludes this lecture. In the next lecture, I will talk more about the settling of the rest of the colonies, the English colonies, but now we've gone through the first two. And I will talk to you next time.